March 7th, 1945. Albert Speer, Hitler's Minister of Armaments, stood in the map room of the Reich Chancellery, watching the Führer's hands tremble as an aide reported the news. American troops had captured the Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen intact. The Rhine, Germany's last major natural barrier, had been breached. For a moment, Hitler said nothing. Then, according to Speer's later testimony, he turned and walked to the window, his voice barely above a whisper. "They're coming," he said. "They're actually coming into Germany itself." What Nazi leaders said as Allied armies poured into the Reich reveals not one response, but many. Some clung to delusion. Others faced reality with desperate calculations. A few chose fanaticism over surrender. Their words, preserved in diaries, official documents, witness testimony, and authenticated records, map the psychological collapse of the Third Reich as thoroughly as any military campaign. The invasion they'd always insisted was impossible had become undeniable. By early March, American, British, and Canadian forces pressed against the Rhine from the Netherlands to Switzerland. In the east, Soviet armies had already crossed into German territory, fighting through East Prussia and Silesia. The question was no longer if Germany would be occupied, but what its leaders would say and do as the end approached. Hitler's public statements maintained the fiction of ultimate victory, even as his private words grew darker. In his last radio address to the German people on January 30th, the 12th anniversary of his rise to power, he'd promised that Germany would quote 2. He spoke of quote 3 that would turn the tide, of historical parallels to Frederick the Great's sudden reversal of fortune in the 7 Years' War. The speech, broadcast nationwide, presented absolute confidence, but behind closed doors, the Führer's words told a different story. Speer recorded multiple conversations from this period in which Hitler's tone shifted dramatically. In one meeting in February, discussing the defense of German cities, Hitler reportedly said, quote, "The statement shocked, even hardened Nazi officials present." Hitler was articulating a philosophy of collective suicide. If Germany could not win, it should not survive. The German people, in his view, had proven themselves weaker than the East and therefore deserved annihilation. This wasn't the public Hitler of radio addresses and newsreels. This was a man preparing for apocalypse. Joseph Goebbels, the propaganda minister, left the most extensive record of Nazi leadership thinking during these months. His diary, captured by the Soviets and later authenticated by historians, continued almost until his death. The entries from March and April 1945 are remarkable for their mixture of delusion, clear-eyed assessment, and fanatical determination. On March 2nd, after Soviet forces had established bridgeheads across the Oder River just 40 miles from Berlin, Goebbels wrote, "The situation in the East is growing more menacing. The English and Americans are also gradually getting closer to the Reich. But I am still firmly convinced that, however grave the crisis at the moment, it will be overcome." He then spent several paragraphs analyzing why he believed this, citing historical examples of nations that had recovered from apparently hopeless positions. But just 3 days later, his tone shifted. "Our military situation has deteriorated so rapidly that I am at a loss for words," he wrote. "We are facing a catastrophe of unimaginable proportions." The entry continued with unusual candor about the state of German defenses, the exhaustion of reserves, the collapse of Allied nations. Then, characteristically, Goebbels pivoted back to determination. "But we will fight on. We have no choice but to fight on." This oscillation between realism and denial marked much of Nazi leadership's response to the invasion. They could see what was happening. The evidence arrived daily in reports of lost cities, broken armies, and advancing enemy columns. Yet they couldn't or wouldn't accept the logical conclusion. On March 7th, the day the Remagen Bridge fell, Goebbels' diary entry focused not on the military implications, but on propaganda strategy. "We must explain to the people that the enemy's advance into Reich territory is actually to our advantage," he wrote. "Now the German people can see with their own eyes what Bolshevism and plutocracy have in store for them. This will stiffen their resistance." He was already crafting the narrative that would justify continued fighting even as Germany was overrun. Hitler's response to the Rhine crossing went beyond words. On March 19th, he issued what became known as the Nero Decree, officially titled, quote, 11, quote, the Order, authenticated and preserved in military archives, commanded the destruction of all military, transportation, communications, and industrial facilities within Germany, to prevent them from falling into enemy hands intact. It read, in part, quote, 12. The decree essentially ordered the complete devastation of Germany. Every bridge, every factory, every power plant, every railway, every communications center was to be demolished. It was the scorched earth policy the Wehrmacht had applied in occupied territories, now turned inward against Germany itself. Speer, who received the order in his capacity as armaments minister, later testified that he was horrified. According to his account, he confronted Hitler directly. Quote 13. Speer said he argued, quote 14. Hitler's response, according to Speer's testimony at Nuremberg and in his memoirs, was chilling. Quote 15. Hitler reportedly said. Quote 16. Whether Hitler used exactly these words remains debated by historians, as Speer's testimony was self-serving in many ways. But the Nero Decree itself is authentic, and its implications were clear. Hitler preferred a dead Germany to a defeated one. Speer claimed he quietly sabotaged the decree's implementation, issuing contradictory orders and delaying demolitions. Other Nazi officials responded differently. Some regional Gauleiters zealously implemented destruction orders. Others ignored them. The divergence in responses reflected a leadership fracturing under pressure. Hermann Göring, commander-in-chief of the Luftwaffe and officially Hitler's designated successor, had grown increasingly marginalized as the war turned. By 1945, Hitler rarely consulted him, and Göring had retreated to his estate at Karienhall, north of Berlin. His statements during this period, recorded by staff and later testified to by witnesses, showed a man trying to preserve his own position while distancing himself from inevitable disaster. In early April, with Soviet forces approaching his estate, Göring ordered his art collection evacuated and Karienhall itself destroyed to prevent its capture. He told his staff, according to their later testimony, "The Führer will see that I, at least, know how to deal with my own property." It was a pointed comment. Göring understood that Hitler's scorched earth orders were being resisted, and he wanted to demonstrate his own loyalty through symbolic destruction. But Göring was also hedging his bets. On April 20th, Hitler's 56th and final birthday, top Nazi leaders gathered in Berlin for what would be their last meeting together. The atmosphere, witnesses later recalled, was surreal. They stood in the bunker beneath the Reich Chancellery, the building above them partially destroyed by bombing, the sound of Soviet artillery audible in the distance, and sang happy birthday to their Führer. Hitler's statement to the assembled leaders was brief and, according to multiple witnesses, strangely detached. He thanked them for their loyalty, spoke vaguely about continuing the struggle, then dismissed them. Several noticed he didn't mention victory. Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz, commander of the Navy, later testified that Hitler seemed to have already separated himself from life. After the meeting, Hitler told Göring and other leaders to leave Berlin and continue directing their spheres of responsibility from southern Germany. It was, in effect, permission to flee. Göring took it immediately, departing for Bavaria with a convoy of trucks carrying his remaining possessions. 3 days later, on April the 23rd, Göring sent a telegram to Hitler from Berchtesgaden. The message, preserved in military communications records, was carefully worded but unmistakable in intent. Goering noted that Hitler was now surrounded in Berlin, cut off from effective command. He referenced a decree from 1941 making him Hitler's successor if Hitler became unable to act. He asked if Hitler agreed that the conditions now applied, and if so, whether he should assume leadership of the Reich immediately. It was a power grab disguised as a respectful inquiry. Goering was asking permission to take over while Hitler was still alive. Martin Bormann, Hitler's personal secretary, and one of the few remaining in the bunker, showed Hitler the telegram. According to witnesses present, Hitler's reaction was explosive. He shouted. Hitler immediately ordered Goering's arrest, stripped him of all offices and ranks, and expelled him from the Nazi Party. A telegram sent in response accused Goering of treasonous negotiations with the enemy and warned that any attempt to act as Führer would result in execution. Goering's attempt revealed how completely the Nazi leadership structure had collapsed. The official successor felt compelled to stage what amounted to a coup to claim his designated position. And Hitler, facing imminent defeat, still had enough residual power to slap him down. But an even greater betrayal was unfolding simultaneously. Heinrich Himmler, Reichsführer SS and one of the most powerful men in Nazi Germany, had been conducting secret negotiations with the Western Allies through Count Volker Bernadotte, a Swedish diplomat. Himmler's statements during these meetings, later reported by Bernadotte, showed a man desperately trying to save himself while maintaining plausible deniability. Bernadotte testified that Himmler insisted any surrender must exclude the Soviet Union. "I've always been opposed to war with the West," Himmler reportedly told him in mid-April. Germany and the West should have been allies against Bolshevism. He offered to order SS units to surrender to American and British forces while continuing to fight the Soviets. It was a fantasy, ignoring the Allied commitment to unconditional surrender and their alliance with the Soviet Union. When Hitler learned of Himmler's negotiations on April 28th, his rage reportedly exceeded even his reaction to Goering. Quote, witnesses heard him say, quote, 25. He ordered Himmler arrested, though by this point such orders were largely meaningless. Himmler was beyond reach, and Hitler's authority had shrunk to the few blocks around his bunker. The discovery of Himmler's betrayal seemed to break something fundamental in Hitler. Hermann Fegelein, Himmler's SS liaison to Hitler and also married to Eva Braun's sister, was arrested trying to flee Berlin. He was shot in the Reich Chancellery Garden on April the 28th on Hitler's direct order. It was one of Hitler's last acts of power, executing a traitor within arm's reach since he couldn't reach the greater traitors beyond. Goebbels remained with Hitler in the bunker, one of the few top leaders who never wavered. His diary entries from late April show no doubt, no negotiation attempts, no hedging. On April 22nd, as Soviet forces tightened their encirclement of Berlin, he wrote, quote, on 26. The entry continued with an analysis of their situation that was remarkable for its clear-eyed assessment, combined with absolute determination to see it through. Quote, 27, he wrote flatly. Quote, 28 here. For Goebbels, this wasn't tragedy. It was the final act of a grand performance. On April the 29th, Hitler married Eva Braun in a brief civil ceremony in the bunker. Afterward, he dictated his political testament, a document authenticated by multiple copies and witness signatures. It's perhaps the most revealing statement of his final mindset. The testament blamed everyone but himself for Germany's defeat. It is untrue that I, or anyone else in Germany, wanted the war in 1939, it began, rewriting history even in his final hours. He blamed international statesmen of Jewish descent or working for Jewish interests for forcing the war. He blamed his generals for betraying him. He blamed the German people for lacking sufficient will. The testament expelled Goering and Himmler from the party for their illegal negotiations with the enemy and treachery to my person. It appointed Admiral Dönitz as Reich President and Goebbels as Reich Chancellor. Then, chillingly, it commanded the new government to uphold the racial laws to the limit and mercilessly resist the universal poisoner of all peoples, international Jewry. Even facing death, with his regime in ruins and his capital overrun, Hitler's final statement returned to the anti-Semitic obsession that had driven him from the beginning. The testament contained no regret, no acceptance of responsibility, no acknowledgement that his decisions had led to this catastrophe. Instead, it projected blame outward and commanded his successors to continue the ideology that had destroyed Germany. The next day, April 30th, Hitler shot himself. Goebbels assumed the chancellorship he'd been appointed to for less than 24 hours. His first act was to attempt surrender negotiations with the Soviets, not for Germany, but specifically to secure safe passage out of Berlin for himself and his family. When the Soviet command demanded unconditional surrender and refused his personal terms, Goebbels made his final decision. On May 1st, Goebbels and his wife Magda poisoned their 6 children in the bunker, then had an SS orderly shoot them both. Before his death, Goebbels dictated an appendix to Hitler's political testament. It read, in part, quote, 34. The statement was characteristically theatrical. Goebbels framed his suicide not as despair or escape, but as the ultimate act of loyalty. He'd spent 12 years crafting propaganda for the Nazi regime. His final propaganda was for himself, ensuring he'd be remembered as the faithful one who never wavered. Not all Nazi leaders chose death. Karl Dönitz, the Admiral Hitler had appointed as his successor, assumed control of what remained of German authority. His first radio address as head of state, broadcast on May 1st, announced Hitler's death and his own succession. "German men and women, soldiers of the German Wehrmacht," he began. "Our Führer, Adolf Hitler, has fallen. The German people bow in deepest sorrow and respect." But Dönitz's statement carefully avoided the word, quote 37. He claimed Hitler had died, unquote 38. It was a lie, but a calculated one. Dönitz was already thinking about how to manage the surrender and preserve what he could of German military honor. Admitting Hitler had killed himself would undermine the narrative of resistance to the end. Over the next week, Dönitz attempted to negotiate a partial surrender, offering to capitulate to Western forces while continuing to fight the Soviets. The Allies refused. On May 7th, General Alfred Jodl signed the unconditional surrender of all German forces at Allied headquarters in Reims, France. The war in Europe was over. Dönitz's government continued to function for another 2 weeks in Flensburg, near the Danish border, before the Allies dissolved it and arrested its members. In his final address before arrest, Dönitz told his staff, "We have been true to our oath. We have fought the good fight." Even in defeat, the language was of honor and duty fulfilled, not of the catastrophic crimes and aggressive war that had led to this moment. Lower-level Nazi officials and regional leaders responded to the invasion with varying degrees of fanaticism, pragmatism, and denial. Some Gauleiters, the regional party leaders, organized last-ditch defenses of their cities. Others fled. A few negotiated local surrenders to spare their populations further destruction. Gauleiter Karl Hanke of Lower Silesia declared Breslau a fortress and ordered it defended to the last. The siege lasted nearly 3 months, ending only on May 6th, 2 days before the general surrender. Hanke escaped by air at the last moment, abandoning the garrison he'd commanded to fight to the end. He was never found, presumably killed in the war's final days. Gauleiter Karl Kaufmann of Hamburg took the opposite approach. As British forces approached in late April, he negotiated the city's surrender against explicit orders from Berlin. Quote Forder. He reportedly told his staff, "The city surrendered on May 3rd with minimal fighting. Kaufmann was arrested but later testified that he'd saved Hamburg from the destruction that had consumed other German cities. These divergent responses, the fanaticism of some and pragmatism of others, reflected a leadership class that had lost any coherent direction. With Hitler dead and central authority collapsed, each official made his own calculation about how to face the end. The statements of Nazi leaders as Allied troops entered Germany reveal not a unified response, but a fragmentation. Some, like Hitler and Goebbels, chose apocalyptic defiance. Others, like Goering and Himmler, attempted to save themselves through betrayal and negotiation. Still others, like Speer, claimed to have quietly resisted the worst orders while remaining in service. And many simply fled or surrendered when the moment came. What unites their statements is a striking absence of remorse. In all the documented words from these final months, in diaries and testimonies and official communications, there's almost no acknowledgement of the crimes committed in Germany's name. Hitler's political testament blamed everyone else. Goebbels' diary entries framed their downfall as tragic drama, not justice. Goering's and Himmler's negotiation attempts sought to preserve their positions, not atone for their actions. Even those like Speer, who later claimed to have recognized the regime's evil, spent the final months focused on Germany's survival and their own roles, not on the millions murdered in concentration camps or the devastation their war of aggression had caused across Europe. Their words as Allied troops entered Germany were about their own fate, their own legacy, their own survival. The Allied soldiers who captured these men found not monsters who reveled in evil, but bureaucrats and ideologues who'd convinced themselves they'd served a righteous cause. Goering, arrested by American troops on May 8th, reportedly greeted his captors cheerfully and expected to be treated as a fellow military professional. Himmler, captured by British forces on May 23rd, carried fake papers and tried to blend in with fleeing German soldiers. When identified, he bit down on a cyanide capsule hidden in his mouth and died within minutes. The last words of Nazi leaders, whether spoken in bunkers or courtrooms or to their captors, rarely included the admission that might have given them meaning, that they had been wrong, that their ideology had been poisonous, that the suffering they'd caused was unjustifiable.